Welcome to Spiritual Psychology. My name's Renee McKenna. I'm a therapist and shamanic healer. And today I want to talk about confrontation, particularly healthy confrontation. I had an interaction with a client earlier this week that's not uncommon in earlier stages on a spiritual path. He's been really upset by these abusive dynamics with his boss at work. And in his words, he's trying to take the high road and let it go. He's been praying for her in between bouts of rage and resentment. There's a pretty common idea in New Age or spiritual circles. Do they still use the term New Age? It's probably like an old age now. But anyway, there's this idea that being angry or confrontational is not spiritual, and that being in a place of compassion, forgiveness, peace, turning the other cheek from Christianity, that is the more elevated approach to intentional negativity. And although forgiveness and compassion are powerful places and perspectives to hold when dealing with someone that wants to harm you, appropriate confrontation is often required and necessary, both to stop the intentional harm coming at us and for our own growth and empowerment. And if we want to think about the turning the other cheek of Jesus, he actually turned over the tables of the money changers in the temple. He physically went in and flipped their business tables over, dumping all their stuff on the floor, because he was confronting the hypocrisy and corruption that was hiding itself under a religious facade. Now, that act actually got him crucified, and he did forgive them all. Now, I happen to think that was by design and not an accident. But many of us are afraid that we will be martyred if we confront the evils, big and small, that cause us harm in our lives. If we look at that story with Jesus metaphorically, his act of public confrontation was the death of his old self and the birth of a new self. It's always bummed me out that the symbol of Christianity and Catholicism is Jesus hanging on the cross. Because to me, the whole point of the story is not the suffering and death. It's the rebirth that happens on Easter morning. And that the death of the old is always followed by the birth of the new. And Jesus, from a biblical perspective, was the catalyst of a new covenant with God, moving from the eye for an eye of the Old Testament to the possibility of perpetual forgiveness in the New Testament. It speaks to the evolution of God, that we are little pieces of consciousness in a larger consciousness system, and as we evolve, the larger system evolves. I believe God is growing, just as we are, that the universe cheers us on when we do challenging and difficult things, when we grow and expand in our capacity and capability to stand in truth, justice, forgiveness, and hope, that the angels and saints, guides and teachers, the life force cheers us on, not because it's a happy bystander at our parade of humanity, but because there's mutual benefit, because we are inextricably connected. That our success is universal success. That difficulties call for change. And that martyrdom and death is not the end of the story, but letting go of the old is required in order to make way for new ways of being and moving through the world. So my client has a job he really, really loves. It's at a medium-sized company, and he works in finance. And his boss has a really abusive and terrible habit of calling him out and putting him down at staff meetings in front of his coworkers and subordinates. It's really bad. So I shared with him this very powerful process that was shared with me very early on my spiritual journey. And it's a very simple process that I call healthy confrontation. Healthy confrontation basically has 3 parts or statements that you make to the person who is harming or who has harmed you. And you say to them simply, when you do this, it makes me feel this. Don't ever do that again. When done face to face, very vulnerably, one-on-one, looking them dead in the eye, it's incredibly effective. When you do this, it makes me feel this. Don't ever do that again. So this healthy confrontation process came out of a therapeutic community in Boston called Woman Inc. It was founded by an ex-heroin addict, Katie Portis. She just died in August of 2020. She helped save and transform the lives of thousands of women addicts, most of whom were poor and destitute, trying to avoid going back to jail. Most of them had children. Long-term therapeutic communities for addiction recovery were really common in the 80s. And although I never went to Woman Inc., I'm deeply grateful to Katie Portis because Woman Inc. saved my life. My first spiritual advisor was a woman named Susan Lydon. She was a short, fat little Jewish woman who went to Woman Inc. and lived there for 3 years to avoid going to prison for shoplifting. She'd been a heroin addict and a street prostitute for years. She had a daughter who she'd become estranged from. She was just starting their relationship again. A few years ago, I had a coincidental opportunity to meet her daughter and tell her that her mother saved my life. Susan and I worked together while she was living at Woman Inc., and we didn't work together for very long, but she watched me descend into the bottom of my addiction, and she helped to pull me out of that pit and start me on the road of my own recovery. Susan and I worked together at a small 2-color offset printing company in North Quincy, Massachusetts, the Ink Spot. And we would meet at lunch, and I would bring my problems to Susan, and she would help me as best she could. She wasn't a terribly selfless person, but there's a wrench for every nut, and she was perfect for me at that time. After I left my job at the Ink Spot, I wasn't very good at commitment or holding jobs for very long at that point in my life. I worked as a file clerk for a big insurance company. There was a whole cadre of us running around this giant paper filing room with manila envelopes for probably $6 an hour or some ridiculous thing. I've worked a lot of menial entry-level jobs in my life. Anyway, there was this skinny, nasty-looking little girl who worked with us, and maybe there were 8 or 10 of us in the file room. And I don't remember the details, but she was talking bad about me behind my back to the other coworkers. Because I was friends with this other girl, and she told me, Susie Q's talking smack about you behind your back. And I was trying to change the way that I lived, so I didn't want to pull out any weird street behavior on the girl. And so, like my client, I started to pray for her, in between feeling really disrespected and betrayed. I've never liked catty woman behavior. In fact, I was really having my first extremely positive and loving experience of sisterhood in my life, in this incredibly honest and supportive community of other young women that was gathering around me, that we were all trying to do the same thing, change our lives for the better. And this file clerk talking shit about me was like a black spot. And so Susan said, you need to confront her, but not in a shoving her against the wall intimidation kind of way, from a place of self-worth, vulnerability, and personal empowerment. And so we talked about what the girl did, and we talked about how it made me feel. And the next day when I went to work, I knew what I needed to do, and it took tremendous courage. I've always had a lot of bravado, but I didn't always have a lot of genuine courage. And being vulnerable and empowered was definitely something new. And so I said a prayer, asked God for help, and I walked up to the girl and I said, I need to talk to you sometime today alone. And she looked at me wide-eyed and said, why, what's up? And I said, I'm not going to do it here. Let's do it at lunch. And my palms were sweating and I felt sick to my stomach. I might have even had to go have diarrhea. I always know if I'm vulnerable and empowered and doing something really brave if I have to have diarrhea before I go do something. Not to be too graphic, but just to let you know, this can be really intense. And for me, that intensity, being able to hold and embody that intensity and do it anyway, that's part of the catalyst for the change within myself. Because appropriate confrontation will change us, regardless of what happens with the other person. So lunchtime came. I said, let's go outside. Again, palms sweating, sick to my stomach, heart pounding. I looked her in the face and I said, so I hear that you're talking bad about me behind my back. And she started to say, well, I didn't. And I put my hand up. Let me finish. I hear that you're talking bad about me behind my back. It makes me feel disempowered. It hurts me. And I feel disrespected. Don't ever do it again. She was mortified. I have to tell you, I don't even know what she said. I'm sure she denied it. And I said, true or untrue, never disrespect me. If you have a problem with me, talk to my face. There was really no discussion to be had. In appropriate confrontation, it's not a conversation. It's a statement. I'll tell you, that girl never messed with me again. And something grew inside me that had not existed before. You might call it self-esteem, self-respect, was self-something. Some aspect of myself that I was willing to care for and take a stand for. I would take a bullet for my good friends, but I'd lay down like a doormat frequently in my own life. So I shared that formula with my client, and I told him, as I know from my own experience, that difficulties in our life are calling us to grow, that healthy confrontation with that girl in the file room changed me. So there's something known as the golden rule, and it's found in most ethical and spiritual religious traditions on earth. It's the rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Altruistic reciprocity can be found in the well-known Torah verse from Jewish scripture, the Old Testament, Leviticus 19:18. Love your neighbor as yourself. And here's the trick with that verse. Most of us fall on one side of it or the other. We're really good at loving others, or we're really good at loving ourselves. And the call to grow is in the place where we're underdeveloped. And so for me, I was not good at loving myself. In order to treat others the way that I would hope to be treated, I need to treat myself the way that I treat others. If I'm willing to rage against the injustice or take a bullet for my buddies, I need to be willing to do that for myself as well. So do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Do unto yourself as you would do unto others. I live a very grace-filled life, and most people tend to project positively onto me, but not everyone, for sure. And so I've had many opportunities to use healthy confrontation in my life. I've used it with my kids, and to some extent my kids have used it with me. But I've developed what I call my 3-day rule. So if I have an interaction with someone that feels off, they say or do something that feels out of integrity or intentionally harmful, whether they're aware of it or not, and I can feel it. There used to be a pretty big gap of time between the event and my feelings, so it took a while often for me to match up what I was feeling with what happened. But that gap has closed over time, and my reaction time is quicker. You know, those kind of interactions where after you leave, you think of all the really great comebacks you could have said, and the time has passed and you can't do it now. And if you're anything like me, sometimes you'll continue that conversation for hours or even days, maybe even years after, depending on the nature of the relationship. Anyway, if it's a minor infraction, I like to give it a couple days. I save appropriate confrontation for what happens after those 3 days if my inner process hasn't settled down and that internal dialogue with the person continues. Lots of times little things will fade away after a couple days. If my sense of harm or injustice doesn't fade after 3 days, it's generally not going to go away for me. And I've had a lot of experiences that's just not that important. So I do try to let it go. But I have to be honest, because if I'm not actually able to let it go, then it probably needs to be confronted. And healthy confrontation can absolutely be done from a place of compassion. There's a very simple tenet, hurt people, hurt people. And my client and I talked about his boss's bad behavior. I would imagine that public shame and humiliation is probably a dynamic that was used on her in her house growing up. That her disempowering and harming him is a way for her to try to manage her own internal emotional fear and distress. That she's empowering herself by disempowering him. It's very bad and abusive behavior. It's also very common and frequently learned. So she's not a very empowered or emotionally healthy person. We can hold compassion for her, and we can still hold her accountable for her own bad behavior. And what she does with that is up to her. But once my client draws that line in the sand, it's unlikely that she will cross it. And if she does, he needs to decide if he wants to work for someone who wants to disempower him. There are many jobs in the world. It's a very generous universe. And allowing people to harm us actually harms them because we're participating in their negative pattern. So I don't consider this a justification. From my perspective, healthy confrontation actually helps the other person because we're calling them to a higher resonance of integrity. Whether they choose to go there or not is up to them. But on the deepest levels, we are all created equal. As the great Mahatma Gandhi said in his loincloth, facing the institutional racism and injustice of the British Empire, perhaps the most powerful worldwide entity up to that point, Gandhi said, "You can chain me, you can torture me, you can even destroy this body, but you will never imprison my mind." And I would add, or destroy my spirit. I aspire to grow that kind of courage. And Gandhi spent a lot of time in prison, and he also freed India from British rule. So when we stand in our own integrity and empowerment, we can be free. So put this simple little practice in your pocket. When you do this, it makes me feel this. Don't ever do that again. If you enjoyed this podcast, consider sharing with a friend or leaving us a 5-star review. If you're interested in finding out about my 3-month mentorship in spiritual psychology, shoot me an email, info@reneemckenna.com. And blessings on your path. Until we meet again, this is Renee LaValle McKenna for Spiritual Psychology.